Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. Now, if a woman experiences a depressive episode during pregnancy, it's typically called antenatal or prenatal depression. And if a woman experiences a depressive episode after delivery, with an upper limit of about 12 months post-birth, it's typically called postpartum or postnatal depression. For the purposes of this video, I'll use the terms prenatal and postnatal depression. Now, to confuse things just a little, the term perinatal depression is used to collectively refer to depressive episodes that occur during pregnancy and or following childbirth. Clinicians and researchers have a keen focus on depression, particularly during the postnatal period, because experiencing depression in the context of having an infant can be especially difficult. That is, you got a mum who may not have previously had a baby and so is negotiating this life-changing event for the first time, and who is more often than not primarily responsible for caring for the baby, while also having to juggle a bunch of other responsibilities. Now, before getting stuck into things, the general point is that depressive disorders tend to go unnoticed and consequently go untreated. Different reasons for this have been put forward. For example, there may be too much pressure on mums to put on a happy face during what is supposed to be a joyful time in life. Or education programs may not do enough to alert mums to the possibility of depression developing. Or healthcare professionals may not properly screen for such problems. At any rate, it's important to recognize the symptoms of depression and to seek help where appropriate. So I'll just quickly talk about diagnosing perinatal depression. There are two manuals that clinicians and researchers use to diagnose a depressive episode. One is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, and the other is the International Classification of Diseases, ICD. Amongst clinicians, use of the DSM and ICD tends to depend upon where you live. I tend to use the DSM, so that's what I'll focus on. So according to the DSM, a depressive episode must be marked by one or other, or both, of the following. First of all, depressed mood on most days, and that might be feeling sad, empty or hopeless. And second, a significant loss of interest or enjoyment in daily activities. Then you also have to be experiencing at least 4 of the following symptoms, or at least 3 if you tick off both of the above symptoms. Weight loss or gain, or a decrease or increase in appetite. Sleeping more or sleeping less. Being physically restless or limited in your physical activity. Feeling fatigued or having low energy, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, having trouble concentrating or being indecisive, experiencing thoughts of death or thinking about suicide. And for a diagnosis of a depressive episode, these symptoms must have been present for at least 2 weeks. Now, you may notice that some of these symptoms can be part and parcel of having a baby. For example, a lot of new mums will be sleeping less, and as a result are probably going to have trouble concentrating, will be feeling fatigued, and potentially may find that their eating habits have changed. Nevertheless, it's been argued that despite some of these symptoms seemingly being a normal part of having a new baby, they can still be valid indicators of depression. But as always, seeing an experienced mental health professional who can help determine what might be typical or atypical in the context of having a baby is important. Probably also worth pointing out that many women will experience a period of low mood after childbirth. And this is the so-called baby blues. The symptoms of the baby blues can include low mood, crying, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, low appetite, and feeling irritable. These symptoms are generally experienced only to a mild degree. The baby blues usually occur within the first 7 to 10 days after delivery, with the most intense period tending to be around 3 to 6 days after giving birth. The baby blues are temporary and do not last for an extended period, that is, less than 2 weeks. The prevalence of the baby blues is a bit hard to pin down, as there are no accepted diagnostic criteria. Depending upon the definition adopted, the percentage of mums who experience the baby blues might be about 25% or has been estimated to be as high as 80%. Either way you look at it, they're probably pretty common. Now in the following, I'm going to discuss the prevalence of prenatal and postnatal depression, focusing on the results of meta-analyses. In this type of research, 2 approaches have commonly been used to identify depression. The first has been to use a questionnaire, usually the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, and has involved classifying a mum as being depressed if they score above some specified cutoff. The good thing about this approach is that it's straightforward and can be widely rolled out at low cost. The bad thing is that depression can't be diagnosed based upon questionnaire scores alone. So what these studies show is the prevalence of relatively high levels of depressive symptoms rather than depressive disorder. The second approach has been to assess mums using a formal diagnostic interview or to screen for depression using a questionnaire, such as the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, and then follow up mums who score above the specified cutoff with a diagnostic interview. Now, the good thing about this approach is that you're properly assessing for depressive disorder. The bad thing is that it's more labor intensive, and if initial screening is used, in principle, you could be missing out on mums who would meet criteria for depression, but you don't catch them due to the cutoff score you've used. So the first study I described was by Underwood, who conducted a meta-analysis of 16 studies involving over 35,000 women. And this study focused on the prevalence of women experiencing high levels of depressive symptoms rather than depressive disorder. The researchers found that across the reviewed studies, the rate of high depressive symptoms was about 17% during pregnancy and about 13% following birth. So experiencing high levels of depressive symptoms during pregnancy and afterwards is quite common. The next meta-analysis focused on the prevalence of depressive disorder. That is, where a mum meets diagnostic criteria for a clinical diagnosis of depression. So Gavin conducted a meta-analysis of 28 studies involving in total over 14,000 women. Now, one thing to mention is that the researchers distinguished major and minor depression. The difference is simply the number of depressive symptoms present. Minor depression is not an official diagnosis you can receive, in that it's not in the DSM. However, the DSM permits a diagnosis of major depression that specifies, that is, mild, moderate, and severe. And so here are the results of this meta-analysis. When considered across pregnancy, the prevalence of major and minor depression was a little under 20%. When looking only at major depression, the prevalence rate was about 13%. The prevalence of major and minor depression was higher in the first trimester compared to the second and thirds, but generally hovered around 10%. When considered across the first 3 months following birth, the prevalence of major and minor depression was again about 20%. And when looking only at major depression, the prevalence rate was about 7%. Following birth, the prevalence of depression reached its peak after about 3 months, when about 15% of women experienced depression. Across the next 4 months, the prevalence of depression dropped to around 10% before falling thereafter to around 5%. And the results of this meta-analysis were largely replicated in a more recent one by Woody. Thus, in summary, the results of these studies suggest that depression, whether you're talking about high levels of depressive symptoms or diagnosis of depressive disorder, is common during pregnancy and following childbirth, particularly in the few months after the kid is born. Now, an obvious next issue is how can you help with depression during these periods? And that's the topic of another video, and you can check out the link to that video down below. For the moment though, that's it for depression during the perinatal period. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.